Okay, apologies for the background noise in the prior segment. I'm recording this in a car, not while driving, a stationary car, but I had the aircon on because it's boiling summer where I am. So I forgot to turn it down for recording, but hopefully you all survived the white noise in the background, so that you can focus on it in the foreground. So now we can talk about the governance of Limbo. And there are two ways to go about this. I'm kind of doing this on the fly, unscripted. So a part of me is tempted to give you a whole philosophy about governance of Behodler, but I don't think that's necessary right now. Just bear in mind this analogy. The Behodler ecosystem governance structure is structured like a typical nation state that is characterized by subsidiarity. So, for instance, the US government with its Federal Reserve, and then, Federal Reserve, that just slips out of my mouth. The federal government, in other words, the central government, and the states that are all semi-autonomous, and have their own constitutions and so on, their own legislatures. And the idea, at least the original 10th Amendment idea behind the federalism of the US system, was that the states would be almost entirely autonomous, and that the federal government would kind of stitch things together. So it was kind of a sort of a European Union. It's not a great analogy, but it's a better analogy. It's a kind of a early European Union or European Community sort of model was the idea behind the US federal system. So that idea of subsidiarity, probably a much better example would be Switzerland, where it's probably the only country where federalism is still truly practiced. So Switzerland, the central government is very low influence compared to other central governments, and it's the cantons, the municipalities, the councils, whatever you call them, where the majority of the power lies. And so it's better to think of it as, if we were to port that analogy to the Behodler ecosystem, it's better to think of it that decisions that need to be frequently made happen at the local level, because they're often not as important to the broader scope of things. So for instance, in Zug in Switzerland, if they need to decide about building a bridge or painting a road or changing the style of street lamps, it's not really a decision that Zurich has to be part of. And I'm sure Zurich wouldn't want to be part of that. So it's not something that should really be debated at the highest level of their federal government. But obviously it should be decided on a municipal level, and most countries do operate that manner. Behodler is quite similar in that in Limbo we have a number of decisions that need to happen with a fair amount of frequency, and a number of decisions which are specific to Limbo. So bubbling up that decision making to the entire overarching DAO of the Behodler ecosystem would clog up the works quite a bit and would be inappropriate. And it would also then mean that we would have to choose one form of consensus model and apply it to all of the dApps in Behodler. So the very unimaginative standard way of building DAOs in Ethereum is to have token-weighted democracies. And the reason that such an innovative and imaginative space has gone for something so 20th century is because it's risky building a DAO. And so it's better to go with something that's predictable and safe. The other reason, I think, is that the teams behind a lot of these dApps often hold an enormous quantity of the governance tokens, so that it's only a democracy in name, or at least in daily operations. The masses are allowed to do their thing, but when the team wants to really sway things, they can. So we don't like this at Behodler. We don't like tacit autocracies, or and for this reason we haven't just rushed to slap on a cookie cutter DAO to rule over the whole thing. If we were to use token-weighted democracy for the Behodler AMM, for instance, it would have fallen apart by now, because essentially someone with a scam coin could purchase a majority of I on the open market, and then vote to have their token listed, and then they can give themselves infinite minting right and drain Behodler of all of its liquidity. So we can't just have an open token-weighted system. That would be Behodler's version of a 51% attack, but it would be one from which it couldn't recover. So that is not good. So if we were to list tokens on Behodler on the AMM, when I say list, if we were to decide on the tokens that need to be listed on Limbo so that they can be listed on Behodler, we would probably need some sort of constitution of rules for the types of appropriate tokens that could be listed on Behodler. And perhaps some of these rules can be checked on the smart contract level, but perhaps you need human eyes to check them out, in which case you would deploy a system like Clearos to have a decentralized dispute resolution for every token that's listed. You have something that's more appropriate to the act of listing tokens on Behodler, so that you're kind of crypto-economically guaranteed to not fall into the trap of listing a dodgy token. Now, let's jump over to Limbo. Suppose we want to change the APY of a particular pool in Limbo. We wanted to change the amount of flan being minted, and we only wanted to change it by a small percentage. This clearly has a far less security impact than that token example I gave. So if we were to then put that decision through this hellish system of courts, if you're going through like the Aragon court system, or you're going through Clearos, and you have round after round and dispute, and it'll slow things down too much. It'll be very discouraging for anyone to ever make changes because of the amount of effort and gas that they would need to expend, just for something so small. So we need something, we need a governance structure for that which is more agile, but which still has some sort of consensus backing, so that we don't have crazy numbers being calibrated to Limbo. So it's important to bear in mind that Limbo is a community calibrated mining farm, liquidity yield mining farm, Dapp, which means that there isn't a central team that's just deciding what is going to be listed on Limbo and what APY and so on. That might be the initial phase, but as people start exercising their power from day one of Limbo's operation, it will be in such a way that if you have enough you can have a large influence on Limbo, and you can take decisions and you can influence decisions on Limbo through various voting mechanics and so on. So what this means is that we've got to have a system of game theoretically balanced incentives in place to ensure that nothing crazy happens in Limbo, that you don't have someone noticing that their project token has been listed on Limbo, so now they go and buy a whole bunch of and set the APY on their token to 10,000%, or maybe I shouldn't give a number, but to set it to an APY that's much higher than the predominant APYs, and then you have a complete dilution of flan, and it's just a complete parasitic sucking of value out of the entire ecosystem towards that project token, and towards holders of that project token. So you obviously don't want things like that happening. It's not as destructive as listing a bad token on Behodler, but it's the next worst thing. So this is where Limbo DAO comes in. So when you're delving into the code of Limbo DAO, you'll notice a few things, and I should be able to state this in fairly simple terms. So the first thing is, if you want a contract to be governed by Limbo DAO, you implement an abstract contract called the governable contract. When you do that, you basically put in place a bunch of infrastructure into your contract that Limbo DAO can hook into in order to govern it. So what I mean by hook into, you are provided with modifiers which you can then add to your public functions or your external facing functions, and you can specify the type of governance you want applied to that function. You've basically got two choices of governance that you can apply to your functions. So intuitively, it's quite intuitive. Intuitively, it's quite intuitive. You inherit the governable abstract class or abstract contract into your contract, and then you're provided with two modifiers that provide you with two types of governance, and you can decide where to apply those and if to apply those. And then Limbo DAO can then govern your contract. So what does it mean, govern your contract? Limbo DAO has two forms of a governance action. The first is a very familiar proposal weighted voting system. So you lodge a proposal, which is a smart contract, and that smart contract does something to something in the Limbo subsystem. So, for instance, it might change the APY on a pool. It might terminate the entire mining process of a particular pool, and there are a number of other things that it can do. So you submit one of these proposal contracts to the Limbo DAO to be lodged, and then people can vote on whether they think that proposal should pass, and there's a window of time, and we'll have to decide what that window of time is. I mean, intuitively for me, 2 days seems right, but we might want it to be faster, we might want it to be slower. That can be calibrated again through proposals. So there's a meta governance aspect of Limbo DAO. The rules of Limbo DAO can be changed through proposals, and these can be voted on. And when the vote passes, then the contract can be immediately executed. Once it's executed, it goes into a dormant state again, which means it loses its power to do what it wanted to do. And if you want it to do that again, you need to go through the whole process again. And if it's rejected, then of course nothing happens. So that's fairly straightforward. Now, what does it mean vote? Who votes? How does this voting work? So you stake the Behodler has a universal liquidity token called I, which you stake into Limbo DAO, and you earn voting points. Those voting points are called Fate. They're not ERC tokens. They just Fate isn't an ERC token. It's just a point system that's non-transferable between users. But you earn Fate in proportion to the I that you stake. You can also stake LP tokens containing I, and then you earn according to a formula as well that is kind of fair for the provision of ILP tokens that you stake it. We have to specify which LP tokens, but essentially the community, through proposals of course, can decide which I-based LP tokens can be staked in order to earn Fate. As you earn Fate, a certain amount of Fate is required to lodge a proposal, and when you deposit that Fate, you get to lodge your proposal. So there's there's already a bit of a cutoff there. You can't just have anyone lodging proposals. You've got to be committed to the system in some way, either by staking a lot of I or by staking I for a long time. But interestingly, the incentives are designed such that Limbo rewards you more for staking, or it disproportionately rewards small stakers who are in it for a long time over whales. And it's actually a quadratic function that. So the whales will get only a square root of what the smaller fish will get. So it's always better to be committed to Limbo. At least Limbo always rewards those who, or listens to those who are committed over those who are rich. So there is, so you earn your Fate by staking I or I-based tokens. Then you can use the Fate to then lodge a token. If your lodged proposal succeeds, half of your staked Fate is burnt. If it fails, the entire quantity is burnt. Burnt is probably the wrong word, because again it's not a token, but is spent out of existence. So remember, Fate is an opportunity cost. It's a measure of opportunity cost. It's not an actual token. Then finally, in terms of Fate incentives, people may feel that if I can be staked on Limbo and earn actual money, it might undermine the incentive to stake on Limbo DAO. And so the community has the option of turning on a flan to Fate exchange rate, so that when you have accumulated Fate, you can burn that Fate and receive flan. So this is kind of like the rage quit model of Moloch DAO and so on. At least it's an analogy to that, in the sense that you can give up your voting power and in return you receive a token, in this case flan. So that will allow you to kind of decide, it allows you to price in how much governance power is worth to you versus just staking in Limbo. And of course, it's not a given that the community will turn this on, because if you're a prospective project to be listed on Behodler, it's in your interest to acquire Fate and to influence the running of Limbo, in much the same way that Curve gains its value because it allows people to decide on which tokens will be listed on Curve and so on. So that's Fate, and that's all intimately tied up with the proposal mechanism. The second form of governance is called flash governance. And this is for decisions that need to happen fairly frequently. You can't wait for voting to happen. So for instance, if one of the tokens turns out to be a rug pull and you need to shut down that pull immediately, flash governance is where you will find relief. You'll be able to call shutdown instantly and shut down that pull. Now there has to be incentives, there has to be a carrot and a stick system with flash governance as well, otherwise you'll just have enemies of Behodler flash governing things into oblivion. So when you perform an action that is a flash governance action, you have to have a certain quantity of I in your wallet, and that I is deducted and deposited into a smart contract and held for a number of days, maybe a number of weeks. The community again will have to decide on that parameter. And while it's being held, the community can then they can deliberate on whether that decision that you took, that flash governance decision you took, was in the best interests of the ecosystem. And if they decide that it wasn't, they'll burn your staked I, or they can burn some proportion of your staked I. But if they decide that you acted in good faith, or you acted in the good interests of the ecosystem, then they release your I back to you. Or at least if they don't take a decision after a certain amount of time, your I is unlocked and you can take it back. So that's basically the stick incentive of flash governance. There will be a number of non-controversial decisions for which flash governance will be very appropriate and low risk. Flash governance can also be used to alter the APY on different pools in Limbo. So before carrying on, it's worth now that you've got a deep dive into Limbo, it's worth transitioning your nomenclature into the Behodler terminology. In the Behodler code base, the pools are called souls because we're keeping with the metaphor of Limbo as the afterlife world of dead, where people who I forget the definition of Limbo. It's if you don't believe in Christianity because it hasn't been invented yet, like if you were born before AD 1, then when you die you go into Limbo, which is kind of like a waiting place. Or if you haven't been baptized, you go into Limbo, and then we decide what happens to see if your soul gets migrated across to heaven. The pools in Limbo are the souls. So returning back to what I was saying, yes, if you want to change the APY on a soul in Limbo, you can do so through flash governance, but because it's flash governance, because you don't want users multiplying the APY by 10,000 or something, there are windows of tolerance around which you can move. So you can set, the community can say okay, the APY can only shift, let's say 1% per day through flash governance. So in that way, and then you can also say that we can only have so many flash governance decisions per day, so that we don't clog up the system with what I call a Karen attack, right? It's like too many people coming to see the manager and doing too much to Limbo DAO, demanding too much of Limbo DAO, and clogging up the whole system and preventing worthwhile decisions from happening. So we can kind of put a circuit breaker on flash governance there. However, just the final point on that, there are some flash governance decisions for which they should always be an option. So for instance, disabling all of Limbo in the case of some sort of exploit being found, or some sort of hack, or some evil token being listed or whatever, that is the type of flash governance decision that you can always take, and there's no amount of Karen metering on that. But of course, if you disable all of if you disable all of Limbo and you haven't got a good reason, you will lose your eye. I mean, the community is going to not enjoy you, and they'll probably ostracize you from the forums and chase you out of town with burning sticks. but the burning sticks mechanism isn't actually included in the scope of the Behodler ecosystem. So what else is there to talk about with governance? Let me pause this recording system in case I want to split the video.